A good day to everyone. I'm Lai Covero of IBON International and International League of People's Struggles Commission 2, Socioeconomic Development for the People. Before we start with our webinar, I have just some reminders for our audience. Please type your questions at the Q&A box, and our panel of speakers will type in their responses. We won't have a live Q&A portion for this webinar. Please use our hashtags and calls in your social media posts. We will flash these on screen from time to time. You can prepare your signs with our calls to action, and towards the end of the program, we'll all open our videos, show our signs, and join our last speaker in the call to action. In behalf of the organizers, we welcome everybody in this webinar on the IMF World Bank as we assert to reclaim our rights and free our tomorrow from the IMF World Bank neoliberal pandemic. As we know, the boards of the IMF and World Bank are holding their annual meeting online for the first time on October 12 to 18, 2020, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has triggered a greater economic crisis than the 2008-2009 Great Recession, causing severe hardship for billions of people and triggering emergency economic and security policies from all affected governments. But even in a time of health and economic crisis, the US-led IMF World Bank forwards monopoly capitalist interests. Today's crisis exposed the impacts of the IMF World Bank's neoliberal policy on people's rights to health and other socioeconomic rights. But these institutions continue to work for domination of capital and transnational corporations in the globe. While the Global South and their peoples are sinking even deeper in debt, the IMF World Bank opposed cancellations and trapped people's futures in continued debt bondage. In a time when the exploitative world economic system itself is in crisis and failing, they remain steadfast in defending it in the name of, quote, recovery, unquote. It is in this context that peoples and their organizations must move towards reclaiming their sovereignty and rights to health, livelihoods, and to their development. And it is with this objective that we hold this webinar today. We have invited the panel of speakers today to help us realize our objectives for this webinar. We have Len Cooper of the International League of People's Struggles, Jennifer Malonzo of IBON International, Joanna Cariño of the Cordillera People's Alliance and IPMSDL, Roland Nassour of the Save Bisri Valley Campaign, Kurniawan Sabar of Indies and the People's Global Conference Against IMF World Bank in 2018, and Sarojeni Rengam of Pesticide Action Network Asia Pacific. We will start off with understanding the nature of the beast, as they say, the true nature, history, and role of the IMF World Bank as a tool of imperialism. I give you Len Cooper, the chairperson of the International League of People's Struggles.
Thank you, Lee. And thank you for this opportunity to have an exchange of views on this important topic. Most likely, we would all agree that the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are agencies of and for imperialism. They are not benign or impartial financial institutions driven by the common good. But like most organisations of state today under capitalism, they're totally driven by the profit motive. The IMF World Bank were formed at the end of the Second World War and have always been controlled by US capital, in line with its position as the dominant imperialist power. The loans made to nations by these institutions are used as weapons to dominate nations. To ensure that the domination and control of these nations by US capital is more likely. The IMF World Bank have flouted human rights conventions and standards constantly, and have supported dictatorships as required by their controlling patron. Famous economist John Maynard Keynes put it succinctly at the time of the formation of the World Bank IMF, explaining that the institutions, the World Bank and IMF, are clearly controlled by the United States. In the so-called industrial age, which was well underway in the 1800s, capitalism developed by making profits from human labour and amassing great wealth for a handful of capitalists at the expense of the impoverishment of the mass of the people. The turn of the century, the 1900s, saw the rise of huge monopolies, the formation of financial trusts and oligarchies, the beginning of the export of capital, and even bigger international combines, and the growth of capitalism into imperialism. Capitalism, in reaching its imperialist stage, led to a world divided and redivided by war between and on behalf of the major imperialist powers competing for dominance: Britain, Germany, Japan, Italy, the USA, etc. Some of these powers became involved in the Second World War. They turned to fascism, for instance, Germany, Japan, and Italy, because they believed it would strengthen their position in the conflict and help prevent a revolution by workers and other toilers in their own countries. The 20th century also saw the development of revolutionary movements and the establishment of socialism, beginning in Russia in 1917, to replace capitalism in ultimately over a third of the world, and the development of movements of the people in many countries for independence and liberation from the dominating colonialist powers. Vietnam is a case in point, where the Vietnamese people defeated first French colonialism and then US imperialism in a war for Vietnamese liberation. Later in the 20th century, after socialism was sabotaged and overthrown by capitalist forces inside and outside those socialist countries, the reintegration of the former socialist countries in the world capitalist system has aggravated the systemic and periodic crisis of capitalism. From the middle of the 1800s alone, capitalism has created disaster after massive disaster for the workers and other toiling people of the world. Look at the pandemics, the depressions, the recessions, the 2 world wars and countless ongoing, more localised wars. The growth of fascism out of the capitalist world in World War II, the continuing growth in the wealth gap between the tiny number of rich and the rest of the world's people, and the current regrowth of fascism in many parts of the world. The people of the world are living in fear of more war, of insecure lives, of poverty, of pandemics, of loss of livelihoods, and of more of the same that capitalism has given them for over 200 years. After 2 massive world wars in the 20th century, with the defeat of German, Japanese, and Italian capitalist challengers, and the exhaustion of British imperialism, US capital became the dominant and, at the time, the unchallenged imperialist power in the world. These wars became about as a result of German imperialism and others wanting to redivide the world's colonies and riches to themselves and away from British imperialism, which was dominant at the time. So US imperialism had a dominant period from about 1945, and via its agencies like the World Bank and the IMF, as well as military supremacy, it was able to spread its policies and programs across the globe. Particularly its neoliberal agenda of cutting wages, privatisation of public enterprises, cutting spending on people's needs, one-sided anti-people trade deals, subsidies for large corporations, and tax cuts for the wealthy, and so on. In addition, the US used its military superiority to overthrow governments, establish more subservient puppet governments in many parts of Latin America, Asia Pacific, Middle East, Africa, etc. And the US led the world, the Western world, in the making of a Cold War with the then socialist countries in the USSR and China and other places. Initially, by the 1970s, the US and its allies were celebrating the so-called demise of socialism in China, and by the 1990s, the so-called demise of socialism in the USSR and other countries. Of course, the process of trying to restore capitalism in these countries started long before, as a result of the capitalist raiders' efforts inside those countries supported by imperialism. However, the celebrations inside the camps of imperialism did not last long after the reincorporation of China and the USSR into the global capitalist system. It was not long before it became clear that these two former socialist countries had become the major capitalist competitors, challenging the US dominance. These developments are worsening the current crisis of the global capitalist system. In the first instance, the neoliberal policies are worsening the crisis by intensifying overproduction, shifting more and more of the burdens of the crisis onto the shoulders of the undeveloped countries and the working class and other toilers, and ever worsening boom-bust cycles. The IMF, World Bank and other agencies are part of this disastrous process. In 2008, the world experienced an acute recession, which it never really recovered from. Then came the global pandemic, which has aggravated and worsened the crisis, with the neoliberal policies making the pandemic much worse than it needed to be. It's clear now that the US is in a steep decline and cannot recover its dominant position. The pandemic has even more clearly demonstrated the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer at a rate even more so than previously. The rich don't have to worry about having jobs, whilst more and more workers are becoming unemployed. The people living in substandard, crowded accommodation or with no accommodation at all, the poor, the homeless, the elderly, the young, are the people who are mainly suffering from the pandemic. In many countries, these are among the very people targeted by the police and the military and other institutions of state. We must recognise the impact on all of us from these events. US imperialism continues its work by, among other things, using its agencies like the World Bank and the IMF to pursue its anti-people neoliberal agenda. More than ever, the people of the world need to mobilise against the attacks on their conditions of life, against the attacks on their democratic rights and their human rights, against war and aggression and the potential of nuclear war, against oppression and exploitation, and against the destruction of the environment by monopoly capitalism. The people of the world are already doing this brilliantly. Just think about the magnificent struggles of the people of the Philippines, the people of the USA itself, the Palestinian people, the Kurdish people and others in the Middle East, the European people fighting fascism, the Latin American people, the Korean people and the Venezuelan people and the Cuban people fighting US imperialism, and many more examples across the globe, which are steadily growing and linking up to form a mighty united front of the people on the way to victory and a better world. Part of this mobilisation is to do as you're doing, and that is to oppose and expose the IMF and World Bank and other imperialist agencies to faithfully follow the path of the profit motive and greed required by the capitalist ruling class. You are right to expose and protest against the programs and behaviour of the IMF and World Bank at the time of its 2020 annual meeting. In this regard, we should applaud the tremendous struggles and demonstrations taking place against the impact of the IMF World Bank programs by the Indonesian workers and students as we speak. All strength to the Indonesian workers and students. Congratulations to the Asia Pacific Network, IBON International, the Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation, the People's Coalition on Food Sovereignty and the ILPS Commission number 2 for this very important initiative. Protect people's rights and welfare, take climate action as a matter of urgency, renationalise the health systems, no taxes for corporate bailouts, and long live international solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Len, for that very enlightening discussion, the sweep of the scope of the history of US imperialism and the role of IMF, World Bank, and other agencies as a tool for US imperialism. And Lena's also mentioned the people's fight against these agencies such as the IMF, World Bank in the past and up to now, including the fight of the Indonesian people against IMF, World Bank policies. And now we go to the present, in the time of the pandemic, which is also a time of health and economic crisis. We'd like to know what are the directions and trends of the IMF, World Bank under the so-called new normal. To share with us an analysis and critique of IMF, World Bank lending, directions, and trends, let us welcome Jennifer Malonzo, Deputy Director of IBON International.
Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Lai said, my discussion will be on the current direction and rhetoric of the IMF, World Bank in this current situation of pandemic and economic crisis. We thank Len Cooper for laying the ground on what the IMF, World Bank are as tools of imperialist exploitation and plunder. So now my presentation will look into two main areas of their so-called response to the pandemic and adjusting to the new normal, which is essentially just, business as usual. One part is on debt, the issue of debt, and their really stubborn refusal to cancel debts despite the sufferings of many populations across the world because of being so much mired in debt. And amid all that, the continuing COVID-19 loans instead of giving grants that also come with neoliberal conditionalities. And the other part of the presentation will delve into the so-called recovery, which is essentially for corporate giants to bail out businesses and to really push to retain the power of corporations and put aside any kind of ambition for fundamental changes in the system. And within this narrative is also what we call the corporate-led development, where the IMF and the World Bank really puts premium on the role of corporations, or what they call the private sector, in development. This is, for example, captured in the World Bank's cascade approach, which they have been promoting since 2017, and even now, as we suffer under the current recession and the pandemic, this narrative of putting private sector first in the discussions on development and in implementing development projects and programs are continuing. So first, let's look at how the IMF and the World Bank refuse to cancel debts that are burdening the people, and instead provide loans that seek them further into debt, and not just the current generation, but also the generations to come. So the IMF and the World Bank, despite strong calls from the international community to cancel debts amid the crisis brought by the pandemic and also the economic crisis that has been on its way even before the pandemic started, they really utterly refuse to cancel debt, and instead what they offer is the so-called debt relief, which are essentially just lengthening the time for payment of debts, and they are highly limited, of course very much temporary, and ensures that debts will be paid in the future, if not now. So there is no canceling of historical debt burdens. Countries are just allowed some space to not pay the debt payments they are due, specifically from May 2020 to end 2020. And even this, the only consideration that they are thinking is to maybe extend a bit into 2021, but really countries are still very much encouraged to continue paying their debts. And this debt relief is also, does not cover all countries. It mainly covers the very poor ones who actually cannot pay anymore their debts. And so these are, the least developed countries and the ones that are really under debt distress. And of course, the debts that will be extended are just for those debts that are owed to creditor governments and not to private capitalist creditors, and even not for the likes of the IMF, World Bank, the multilateral development banks. The World Bank even claims that, if countries don't continue to pay debts to them, it will be to their detriment. And even the IMF also has so-called calls for reform in the debt architecture, but it is actually just to minimize the disruptions in payments. So all in all, it's still about ensuring that the money flows from the south to the north in terms of debt payments. And of course, we know that alongside this debt relation is also the continuing imposition of neoliberal conditionalities, including neoliberal austerity measures that prevent countries from spending budgets on social services, and also compels countries to continue burdening people with regressive taxes. And then while they are very much against canceling debts, they still continue to sink people into debt. For example, the IMF, of its about 1 trillion capacity to lend, billions are already billed for loans to about 80-something countries. So this is data as of September 2020. And of the 11.3 billion of IMF COVID-19 money that are already used by 28 countries who are at high risk of debt crisis, the COVID-19 money is actually used to pay for private capitalist creditors. Loans for the likes of Egypt, Ukraine, Jordan, Pakistan, and Ecuador, of course, came with neoliberal austerity conditionalities that actually prevent them from using their own resources to address COVID-19. So that's on the IMF side. For the World Bank, it has some 160 billion, which they say will be available for countries. But of course, these are once again more about loans. No, more than 2/3 are loans, and only some fraction given as grants. And of course, as earlier said, the World Bank continues to receive debt payments from their client countries. So as of July 2020, the World Bank received about 1.7 billion in debt repayments. So this happened while countries are suffering the impact of the pandemic. One concrete example is the Philippines, of course, who has a long relationship with the World Bank. So the World Bank is providing over $1 billion of loans we have here 3 various programs, no? Which, as our mother institution, the IBON Foundation, said, will only be used to support big businesses in the form of tax deferrals, low interest loans, and various credit guarantee schemes, and also to push for it for the Duterte administration's build program, which has been really disastrous for communities, and of course to attract more foreign investments and to provide business capacity for tourism, and there is not at all relief for the Filipino population themselves, as Duterte has announced. There's no more money for you. So yeah, so that's the experience of the Philippines. Now, aside from the debt issue and the continuing debt bandage of developing countries, the IMF and the World Bank are also pushing for what they call the new normal responses, which are actually all just to save, corporate giants through bailouts, etc., and also to appease or weaken the people's resistance. So this so-called recovery is really sham, as it is not recovery to help the people of the developing countries, but to ensure that corporations continue to profit from the hardships of the people. So, and also amid this, as we have seen from months and years before the pandemic hit us, there has been already a rising protests in various parts of the world against neoliberal globalization. And so the IMF and the World Bank, of course, are trying to dampen those protests and show people's action and resistance. So within this so-called recovery are some elements include forwarding a so-called green agenda, but really it's to ensure that the sustainable development agenda is something that can be profited from. It is actually an attempt to diffuse the recognition that the crisis we are in right now and the climate emergency are actually caused by monopoly capitalism. And so this is just about greenwashing the anti-people programs and anti-people infrastructure that has been ongoing in the South. So that is the so-called green agenda of the IMF and the World Bank. On the other hand, there's also a lot of talk about digitalization. Of course, without really addressing that, digital and other technology are in the monopoly control of corporations. And so these techno fixes are actually just perpetuating the exploitative socioeconomic norms that keep workers in so-called value chains that give them really raise to the bottom wages and really precarious conditions. And lastly, also there is this so-called realization from the IMF and the World Bank that there is a need for social protection. However, we know that this is total hypocrisy because amid the decades of continuing neoliberal policies that have privatized services such as health, education, etc., you now call for social protection. And then, of course, we know that development approaches continue to be corporate-led and are not really attuned to the needs and rights of the people. So we feel that this so-called call for social protection is actually just to dampen the people's growing concerns to rising poverty, inequalities, and overall to diffuse the people's resistance to the economic system that we have right now. So straight from the horse's mouth at the World Economic Forum, the IMF said they just want, a great reset for capitalism. So the question for us now is, of course, will we allow that? Of course not. So that's why our call is really for us to reclaim our health, our rights, and our future, and to also heighten our call to shut down the IMF World Bank. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen, for that very good presentation. Now we see that IMF World Bank continues its role of working for the domination of capital and TNCs through loans to peoples of the Global South in the name of recovery, in the guise of the new normal, which is really business as usual. But the peoples of the world have historically fought against IMF World Bank, as Len has earlier said, and as Chen has called during the end of her presentation. And so at this point in our program, we now move to short presentations on successes of people's struggles. We will hear today stories and lessons about indigenous peoples, communities, people's organizations, and social movements who fought for their rights and resisted the IMF World Bank. We will begin with Joanna Cariño of the Cordillera People's Alliance and Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation. She will share the historic victory of the indigenous peoples against the Chico Dam project in northern Philippines.
After martial law was declared in the Philippines in 1972, and with the international oil crisis as justification, the dictator Ferdinand Marcos announced that among his flagship projects was the Chico River Basin Development Project, with funding to come from the World Bank. The proposal was to build 4 mega dams along the Chico River, 2 in the Mountain Province and 2 in Kalinga, to generate 650 megawatts of hydropower. There was no free, prior, and informed consent to the dam project, which would submerge villages and rice lands, displace whole communities, and adversely affect thousands of Bontoc and Kalinga indigenous peoples. In fact, the villages along the Chico River were not even informed about it. They learned of the project only when survey teams entered their ancestral territories. They were deeply disturbed by this aggression without any prior consultation or explanation. The indigenous villages along the Chico River that would be affected by the construction of the dams are tribal societies with an intricate network of peace pacts, or budong, not only with their direct neighbors, but extending over a wide area of associative relations. The news that huge dams were to be constructed along the Chico River soon spread through this indigenous socio-political system of the budong, or peace pact, to many of the villages in the interior, many of which were not yet then reached by roads. Community meetings and peace pact conferences were called. The common theme in these gatherings was the great danger posed by the dams to the life, land, and honor of these indigenous communities along the Chico, and the need, therefore, to unite and resist, even unto death. The traditional peace pact is a bilateral agreement which governs the relations between two tribal communities. The life-threatening dams accelerated the process of social change in that it catalyzed the Binodngan or peace pact practicing communities along the Chico River to go into multilateral Budong agreements. The Presidential Assistant on National Minorities, Manuel Elizalde, was sent to Kalinga to coordinate efforts to minimize the opposition to Chico 4. Elizalde set up the Kalinga Special Development Region and tried to win support for the dam project by bringing in truckloads of canned goods, flashlights, basketballs, and chocolates to the villages he visited. When all of this did not work, he tried to bribe and co-opt some of the tribal elders in the classic tactic of divide and rule. He promised scholarships and developed a relocation area. He finally resorted to arming one tribe against the other with high-powered firearms, thus escalating the conflict. Direct confrontation and human barricades were the people's response wherever the National Power Corporation would try to set up their work camps. In one dramatic mass action, the Dupag villagers dismantled the NPC camp in Tomyangan, and the tribal men, women, and even children carried the construction materials and marched some 25 kilometers to dump these at the military camp in the provincial capital. In another instance, hundreds of community folk were herded and thrown into prison for refusing to vote in a staged referendum of the Marcos dictatorship. Kalinga was rapidly militarized as the Philippine military was brought in after Panamin was unable to convince the people to agree to the dam project. During this period, many of the finest of the sons and even daughters of the indigenous communities joined the armed struggle of the New People's Army, which had expanded into the area after the dam issue broke out. On April 24, 1980, military troops of the Marcos dictatorship gunned down Makliing Dulag of the Butbut tribe in Bugnay, Tinglayan, Kalinga. Makliing was one of the outspoken critics of the opposition to the Chico dams. He was killed in the dead of night by the Philippine military in an effort to intimidate the indigenous opposition. Instead of being cowed, however, his death further solidified the resistance. In 1983, the Kalinga Bontoc Peace Pact Holders Association was organized in Buskalan, Tinglayan, Kalinga. The Budong Assembly was attended by Peace Pact holders and tribal elders from the dam-affected villages and their wider Peace Pact partners in another example of the transforming multilateral Budong. The KB-PPHA later transformed into the Cordillera Budong Association in 1985. These indigenous peoples of Kalinga and Bontoc, considered by many as among the most neglected and powerless sectors of Philippine society, were able to stop development aggression of the Marcos dictatorship and the World Bank by asserting their collective human rights to ancestral land and self-determination. In their steadfast and uncompromising defense of their land, life, and honor, they earned the respect and support not only of the other indigenous peoples in the Cordillera, but also other progressive forces both in the Philippines and abroad. When they finally resorted to armed resistance after peaceful methods to seek redress of grievances had proved futile, this was but the next logical step for these warrior societies. The unfolding Chico drama ignited dormant Igorot nationalism. Igorot students and intellectuals put their energies into the more serious discussion and study of what it meant to be indigenous peoples and national minorities. Numerous activists and mass leaders espousing their rights as indigenous peoples emerged. The different Cordillera tribes were challenged into the recognition of the pressing need for a greater unity among themselves as indigenous peoples and as Filipinos. This increased self-awareness and conscientization among the indigenous peoples of the Cordillera paved the way towards a pan-Cordillera mass movement as it marked the shift from spontaneous reaction to conscious and concerted unified action. As the different Igorot tribes and sectors were increasingly exposed to each other in mass meetings, intertribal activities, and Bodong conferences, there was the opportunity for dialogue and mutual sharing and learning. From here, the different tribes and sectors realized that they shared a common history of oppression, a common geography and territory, the Cordillera Mountain Range, a common persistence of indigenous cultures, although in varying degrees, common problems, and common enemies. Chico brought to the fore the fact that the present-day problems of tribal peoples and indigenous communities are much bigger and more complicated than any faced in earlier historical periods. More concretely, Chico showed the indigenous peoples of the Cordillera that their problems cannot be taken in isolation from the wider Philippine realities and the incursions of imperialist globalization. The common view of indigenous communities as traditionally conservative and resistant to change was proven wrong, as the Kalinga and Bontoc united with as broad an alliance as possible in defense of indigenous people's rights and against dictatorship. The people reaffirmed the tribal practice of total community mobilization in defense of life, land, and honor. Although the Chico resistance at the start was the spontaneous tribal response to outside threat, it soon positioned itself firmly within the front line of the anti-dictatorship and national democratic struggle. In February 1986, the Marcos dictatorship was ousted and Corazon Aquino assumed the presidency. The whole world recognized that people power had ousted the dictator Marcos. But not very many know that it was indigenous people's power that had effectively stopped the World Bank-funded Chico Dam project dead in its tracks.
Wait lang po. Okay. 3, 2, 1.
Thank you very much to Joanna for that very inspiring presentation, because the Cordillera people's victory is quite important for us amid the continued World Bank projects of development aggression today. Before we move on to the next speaker, I would just like to repeat the announcement at the beginning of this webinar that for the participants' questions, please type your questions at the box, at the icon Q&A, the box there for question and answer, and our panelists will respond to your questions there, as we will not have a time for live question and answer portion in this webinar. And also would like to remind everybody to please prepare your slogans and calls that we'll be able to show towards the end of this program when we do the call for action. And now for our next speaker. The next speaker will talk about how struggles continue in 2020 with the People's Campaign that won against a harmful dam project. To share with us the story of the Save Bisri Valley campaign in Lebanon, we're glad to have with us Roland Nassour, the coordinator of this campaign.
Okay. Does it work? Do you see the screen shared? Okay. Founded in 2018, the Save the Bisri Valley campaign aimed to stop the Bisri Dam project, financed by the World Bank through big loans. It's the largest dam project in Lebanon and the largest investment by the World Bank in the country. The government's dam-based water policy has always been encouraged by the World Bank and by the local political power-sharing system intertwined with corporate interests. While the country's economy is on the brink of total collapse, additional debt would worsen the crisis. The Bisri Dam would serve as an ideal opportunity for cost overruns and would be responsible for an unprecedented environmental and cultural destruction. The Bisri Valley is considered one of the major landscapes in Lebanon. It encompasses a wide variety of natural habitats and is an important area for migratory birds. The valley is abundant with historical sites that testify to all of Lebanon's history since the Bronze Age. The dam would also destroy much needed agricultural land and displace farmers. Additionally, the dam was planned to be built on top of an active seismic fault, posing risks of reservoir-triggered earthquakes. The World Bank has not only supported the project, but actually lobbied with Lebanese politicians to convince them to take the loan and used fraudulent tools to defend the project. For instance, the World Bank launched a paid campaign on social media, targeting the people of Lebanon with false advertisements about the dam. The advertisements portray a tragic situation where Lebanese children are suffering from drought and thirst. This catastrophic portrayal is, of course, completely inaccurate, as Lebanon has never experienced extreme water scarcity. Water problems have always been limited in time and scale and were due to mismanagement, corruption, and technical failures. The World Bank also dismissed all assessments and studies that don't fit their agenda and claimed that they conducted extensive consultation and that the project garnered consensus from citizens, which is untrue. In fact, the bank's staff used the meetings with the civil society to legitimize their participatory processes and as a fake demonstration of inclusiveness and transparency. Disappointed with the bank management, we filed a complaint to the inspection panel, or the so-called independent accountability mechanism in the bank. The inspection panel worked actively on acquitting the management by ensuring that a checklist of needed studies and measures is met, rather than giving weight to the quality of these studies, to local participation, or to the grave social, environmental, and economic harms of the project. The Save the Bisri Valley campaign had to challenge an unfavorable balance of power. As we can see in this power map, most of the sectarian political parties in Lebanon, the construction businesses, the state institutions, even the academic institutions were in favor of the dam project. We will see later how we managed to break this network and make a lot of these stakeholders change their minds, not by force of logic, but by all the grassroots activities that we organized. The campaign grew into a political movement that for the first time was able to halt the construction of a large dam in Lebanon. The movement took advantage of a unique political opportunity structure consisting of the following. One, the World Bank's financing of the project, which provided a new venue for contestation. Two, the cracks in the political system. Three, the growing power of the civil society since 2015. And four, the economic crisis that weakened the system and its legitimacy. Such opportunities can be crucial for social movements in the global south in general. The campaign diffused contention into different venues and targeted actors at multiple scales, the local, national, and transnational. Locally, the campaign stirred mobilization by forging connections with the Bisri Valley's residents, simultaneously learning from them, but also empowering them with expert knowledge and media exposure. We defended the right to access land and maintain livelihoods, linking environmental risks to social, economic, and safety concerns. This collaboration between locals, activists, and experts was very essential. On the national level, we worked actively on forming public opinion and stirring public debates through the dissemination of alternative knowledge using social media and by favoring a rhetoric that builds collective identity. We promoted Bisri as a symbol of the natural and cultural heritage of Lebanon. And we promoted, and we also sought to shift paradigms in the water sector and discredit the claim that large dams are viable solutions for water. Upscaling the discourse beyond environmental issues was key to challenge the modernist and industrial arguments that are intrinsically embedded in the system in Lebanon. We shifted the discussion from focusing on a particular dam issue to tackling the inherent problems of water management, public policy, and development strategies in Lebanon, as well as the problem with international financing and the World Bank. The use of a political language outside the government's grid of intelligibility, focusing on radical alternative solutions for water, helped the campaign garner substantial public support at the national level. In addition, the campaign built a powerful anti-dam network involving environmental NGOs and political groups. It developed solidarity links with the October 17 uprising that started last year and integrated with the national struggle for political change and economic reform. The uprising provided the campaign with what we can call discursive opportunities, meaning the dominant public discourse that influenced the movement's intensity and potential of success. Stopping the Bisri Dam became one of the uprising's main demands, with thousands of people protesting in the valley and forcing the contractor to stop the works. The campaign involved different forms of on-the-ground actions, ranging from recreational events to intense protests, sit-ins, and confrontation with security forces. These actions took place in the Bisri Valley, but also in Beirut, in front of governmental institutions and in front of the World Bank offices. On the international level, and given the disappointment by the World Bank's management and its accountability mechanism as well, we lobbied officials in the bank's member countries, especially Germany and the Green Party there, and collaborated with international NGOs and parties to influence the World Bank's decisions, and reached out to international media to pressure the bank with adverse publicity and threaten them with reputational risks. On September 4, the World Bank announced the cancellation of its funding for the Bisri Dam project. This victory is very symbolic for Lebanon because it challenges policies that have devastated our environment for years, often encouraged by the World Bank. But it's also a huge victory on the international stage because it's rare that the World Bank would withdraw a loan, especially after years of the agreement and after the work have already started. We have proven that the World Bank that they cannot claim to commit to climate change mitigation, sustainable development practice, and participatory projects while investing in mega projects like the Bisri Dam. And we have proven what is possible with the power and momentum of well-organized civil society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roland, for your presentation. Your victory in Lebanon proves to us that we can win today, as we have won in the past against the IMF World Bank, the struggles against the IMF World Bank, as they have been continuously promoting the corporate capture of development against the people and the planet. Your victory in Lebanon and in the Philippines, as shared by Joanna, Cariño, has proven that collective fight of the people wins victories in constant struggle for rights. So after the two previous presenters on victories in communities reclaiming their rights to land, life, and livelihoods, we will proceed to our last presentation for today. And for this, we will be presenting videos of the People's Global Conference against IMF World Bank, which was a campaign in 2018 when the IMF World Bank had a meeting in Bali, Indonesia. We will be showing two videos. One is about the event, which was titled Bubarkan, or Fight Against IMF World Bank, which was the call of the People's Global Conference in 2018. And then we'll show a video presentation of Kurniawan Sabar, who is one of the Global Coordinating Committee of the People's Global Conference, to share the lessons of that campaign. So if our video is ready, we will be showing it in a bit.
organisasi rakyat lainnya.
After martial law was declared,
Kosong. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Okay, the last point is about what is the political achievement of PGC in Bali as the part of the advocacy campaign and organizing efforts in Bali. The first important point is through the PGC inside and outside effort that we have, it is successively unmasked, exposed and opposed the fascist and undemocratic condition and policies of the government of Indonesia supported by the IMF and World Bank. As you know that Bali is one of the international tourism destination that maybe most of the people recognize Bali is a very peace, quote unquote, area, very democratic, very warm for all of the people. But through this campaign, we actually unmask what is behind of all of this condition, because under the political situation, they are actually have the fascist character and undemocratic conditions, undemocratic policies to actually targeted and pressure the movement and democratic movement, not only in Bali but also in many regions in Indonesia during that campaign, and also in many countries who also connected to the campaign of the PGC during that time. So the PGC itself during this campaign is actually recognized as the most critical people's struggle against IMF World Bank. And with good flexibility, creativity, sharp and firm political resolve, the PGC broke the imposed silence by the IMF World Bank and the Indonesian government on civil society and people's movement. So despite the intimidation, surveillance, and banning, the PGC come more than achieve its state political objectives. And the second achievement is the PGC actually success to expand and strengthen the alliance and support for the movement building. So I think this achievement is very critical. It's a very substantial achievement, not only for movement building itself, but to support all of the effort in the advocacy and campaign that related to issues regarding on the international financial institution brought by the people or people's organization and social movement that attended in Bali or follow with all of the campaign of the PGC in Bali. So that's why we during overall of the activities we actually gathered support and the PGC participated by 450 delegates, supporters, and observers that representing 93 organizations from at least 18 countries, territories, and autonomous regions across global regions participated in a series of activities in Denpasar, Bali, Indonesia, under initiative of the People's Global Conference Against IMF World Bank or PGC. And the third important important achievement is the PGC is success in asserting critical voices and demand of the people and CSO against the policies and impacts of the IFIs that refers to World Bank and IMF as the giant international financial institutions. And for the context of Indonesia, this achievement is related to the support and contribution for building of movement and people's organization in Indonesia, especially peasant and labor movement. And this achievement also hoped by our movement, our organization, our people that not this achievement not stop just in Bali campaign, but under this condition now, as we now see that the World Bank, IMF, or other financial institution and regulation of the government and the state is very undemocratic, is very fascist, is very intimidate and repress all of the right of the people. So we strongly emphasize that we need more stronger solidarity and support to build up all of the movement, especially the peasant and labor, and also the national minority group and other sector like women and youth sector. So we hope that this achievement that can become a basis, a strong basis for us to continue our solidarity, our movement building, not only in the efforts of advocacy and campaign, but most important points is this support can strengthen our effort to build the stronger movement and massive movement, not only in Indonesia but all of the region in Asia, all or all the country around the world who face the bad impact due to the operation of the international financial institutions. So I think that's all for now as a point of my presentation here.
So our thanks to Wawan for the presentation. And again, would like to thank all the presenters who have presented the successful struggles and fights against IMF World Bank. And we hope that these successes will inspire us more to fight against the neoliberal policies and projects of IMF World Bank and inspire us to continue in reclaiming our rights to development, continue to fight for our rights as a people. And now, before we move on to the end of our webinar, we'd just like to remind again our participants that will be able to join the call to action towards the end by please prepare your slogans or demands and print it out or have it written. And then towards the end, we'll be able to open our videos and show our printouts and join our last speaker for the closing action. And now, we're nearing the end of our program. We would like to call Sarojeni Rengam, the Executive Director of the Pesticide Action Network Asia Pacific and the Vice Chairperson for Asia Pacific of the International League of People's Struggles, to deliver a call for action and closing speech for today. I give you over to Lai.
Yes, thank you, Lai. It is clear that the IMF World Bank are tools of the US and other imperialist countries for profit making and for their own TNCs. It's very clear from Len and from Jennifer and all the others who have spoken that this is really a very important tool for these imperialist countries. They restructure the economies of developing countries and the poorest countries to be dependent on foreign debt and foreign direct investments. Debt service payments to imperialist banks and profits remittances by corporations keep the developing countries impoverished, underdeveloped, and subservient to the imperialist countries. At the beginning of the global debt crisis in the 1980s, World Bank IMF implemented structural adjustment programs with stringent conditionalities attached to their loans to low-income countries. The 1980s and the 1990s, conditionalities forced an export-led model of growth on the least low-income countries to address fiscal imbalances. For many developing countries, this meant increasing production and export of cash crops as their area of comparative advantage. This not only led to faster adoption of the corporate agriculture model, but also tied countries to imports of industrial goods from the north with unequal terms of trade. No consideration was given to the industries or processed products from crops that would add value to the exports. SAP's open agriculture and services to TNCs. These processes extended the impacts of the Green Revolution, entrenching the power of agrochemical TNCs and others over food production systems. The policy shift from food self-sufficiency and local production to export crops made countries dependent on imports. By the 1990s, there was an influx of subsidized rice imports, which depressed the price of local rice. And working with farmers, this is a very important issue for small-scale farmers who went into debt, and many actually stopped growing rice. So then after that, what happened was the adverse impacts of SAP on the lives of the poorest, and in particularly small-scale farming communities, introduced new conditions for loans and debt relief in the form of poverty reduction strategy papers. A PRSP is supposed to be nationally based development program focused on poverty reduction. But in reality, the IMF and the World Bank need to endorse and accept a PRSP only if it meets their lending policies. These policies remain anchored to rigid macroeconomic and structural standards of the SAP's era, which promote privatization, liberalization, and a reduced role for the state, conditions that negatively impact on the poor. Borrowing countries abdicate sovereignty, governance, and independence, national development policies in preparing these papers that IMF and become World Bank compliant. Then in 2017, it is maximizing finance for development approach and the push for de-risking private sector investments, facilitating the corporate capture of development. They promote the idea of private-public interests and that they are aligned to the public interests. But in reality, it just ensures corporate profits serve the imperialist powers. In fact, top borrowers of the World Bank include rich emerging economies of the G20s that are lucrative for private investors and contractors. World Bank projects are mainly done by partly or fully by TNCs or affiliate firms working on contracts. The PPP provide publicly guaranteed income streams to private companies through contract-based rights to public money or monopoly income streams from services relied by the public, such as roads, schools, hospitals, etc. In case the private companies are unable to recover their costs or projected income from user fees, the government has to shoulder the expected returns of the investors. So it is clear that, the World Bank is really clearly supporting transnational corporations and private sector, and that are based, many of them, in the imperialist countries, and particularly in the US. It is also clear that the protest and organizing of campaigns against World Bank IMF are really needed to stop the imperialist and corporate control against the people's right to development and against food sovereignty. Even in this time of COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis, the US-led IMF World Bank still pushes monopoly control and their interests. Basically, today's crisis exposes the failures and intensifies the effects of the IMF World Bank neoliberal policies and their impacts on people's rights to health and other socio-economic rights. But these institutions are not listening, they're not bothered. They continue to work for domination of capital and TNCs, both in development. So while the global South and their peoples are sinking even deeper in debt and trap people's futures in continued debt bondage, but what we are seeing is that the people are organizing, they are building and strengthening movements of peasants, workers, indigenous peoples, and women and others to challenge these developments, as well as to build and strengthen the people's alternatives. The amazing resistance and struggles that we have just heard, both in Cordillera, Lebanon, and Indonesia, and as well as many parts of the world, gives testament that a unified people struggle can stop anti-people development and to assert people's rights and sovereignty. People's movements and their organizations are advancing and reclaiming their sovereignty and rights to health, livelihoods, and to their development. They continue to oppose the IMF World Bank's business as usual for TNCs and creditor capital disguised as responding to the pandemic and its aftermath, while they're organizing to resist, so the people are therefore organizing to resist these developments. They're also building their own alternatives and people's solutions. So today I am honored to share with you the calls of the people's movements and to conclude this webinar against World Bank IMF. The calls are: reclaim our health, rights and future, cancel the debts now, fight for the people's right to development, resist corporate bailouts and recovery, no to corporate climate solutions, stop socially environmentally destructive projects, people-powered climate action now, stop land grabbing, fight for genuine land reform and national industrialization, fight for people's access to social services, shut down the IMF World Bank. Switch on all our videos. Stop socially, environmentally destructive projects.
Stop socially,
environmentally
projects.
People-powered climate action now.
People-powered climate action now.
Stop land grabbing.
Stop land grabbing.
Fight for genuine land reform and national industrialization.
Fight for
genuine land reform
and national industrialization.
Fight for people's access to social services.
Fight for people's access to social services.
Shut down the IMF World Bank.
Shut down the IMF World Bank.
Long live international solidarity.
Long live international solidarity.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saro. Thank you very much for all the presenters and everyone who attended this webinar today. And in behalf of the organizers, I thank everybody and I wish everybody to continue on with the fight. And for today, I greet everybody to have a good day.